Thank you, Rachel. Thank to the co-organizers and particularly John and Rachel at Esperanza. Good morning, everybody. Very exciting to be here. My name is Kenn, as you say, and today we have a select group of luminaries from both the field of education, educators, as well as from the business world. Right? And as John said, because we want this discussion to include folks from both of those areas and perhaps, as you'll hear from today, folks from even other areas as well. So not going to spend too much time, or actually much time at all with introductions. Maybe you've Googled some of the panelists beforehand. You can certainly see their backgrounds, and I encourage you to do more research on them. Perhaps not now, let's listen to them now, but perhaps later if you haven't done so yet. In this sharing session is basically, we're going to be doing all Q&A. First, I think the first 30 minutes will be some questions that myself and some others actually have prepared, some things we want to dig into and would love to hear from the panelists on. But please now start thinking about questions you may actually have for the panelists, and you can begin actually as we hear from them to add those into the Q&A list, and we will spend the latter part, 15-20 minutes of our discussion hearing from you and answering your questions. So let's dig right in. First I really want to set the stage, and considering the situation in our modern world, I really want to, and I'll first actually start this by directing this question to Joe and Kenichi, but tell us a bit about, in your experience, how has the pandemic accelerated the shift in employment trends recently? And in particular, how has it accelerated the change in the skills needed for our modern world, and we say the 21st century. So very curious to hear Joe's and Kenichi's takes on this.
Well, first of all, in terms of the trend, I think the skill sharing economy is really here. So it means to get side jobs has become more popular right now. So in this self-restraint life, they do need to manage their time on their own. So the people who are good at managing time, they can share their own lifetime to the second job or third job with their passion and skill. And this is a big trend even in Japan and even in my country and in my company too. So, and these people are especially a big trend for high-skilled people, not only IT engineers, but for instance, corporate staff like legal, finance, and HR. So I think this skill sharing economy has come. So this is a big point. And regarding the skills, I want to mention two skills. First one is quite basic. We need facilitation skill, especially like today, online meeting, to make the meeting very valuable, even in the online meeting with diverse people. So this is a basic skill. And the second skill I think quite essential is the communication with impact. In other words, EQ, intelligence, emotional intelligence, because in this uncertain world, there is no perfect answer. So emotion or feeling becomes much important than correctiveness. So we need to persuade not only cognitive persuasion, but also emotional persuasion is necessary. So, and also it contains active listening, for instance. So communication with impact is the second skill. This is my opinion.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing, Kenichi. When I think about side jobs, it makes me think a lot about how attitudes to that, now are being actually forced. People are forced to change some attitudes, or some of the business world, had particular attitudes towards that in the past, but now I'm sure things are changing quite quickly. Joe, curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think that, we have lots of debates, right, around what has, the COVID-19 fundamentally changed around the workforce, and I think that we think about it a little bit as more acceleration of some trends that has already been there, right? And I think that these are, the very obvious ones are obviously, the more kind of digital skills you have, the more kind of value you are in the workforce, right? So I do think that given, both kind of work from home and a lot of companies who are really thinking around how to redistribute a little bit their workforce, right? I do think that people who are, again, more electronic in the ways how you document things, how you share ideas over, both kind of remotely, but also, how do you leverage the tools that are available? And I think that that poses a very big challenge for a lot of, I would say, the previous generation, right, who basically have relied a lot. I mean, I think the younger generation is actually quite all set for this one, right? Because on this one, I think that the older generation is actually the ones that actually have a little bit more trouble, right, actually dealing with this. But then there's another whole other scheme of things that's coming in here, right, which is around, I think Kenichi talked about is the gig economy, right? So basically, we're doing a whole season of recruiting without seeing the person. And sometimes you think about it, you're like, well, if physically, we're not going to see these people, then they don't even need to be working full-time for us, because all you need is them to fulfill a certain task in a certain time. And so if that's the case, right, the kind of freelance, right, and people who are working around the world is a lot more empowered, right? Now, that brings in many challenges in many ways, right? So confidentiality is a very big one. If you think about training, is difficult. If you think about ethics, I think that there's also a lot around there that's actually much harder, right? And we feel sometimes that, can you have a senior hire that you've never seen before, right? And that's actually not a very easy thing to think about, right? So, I think, if I flip back on just my final comment here, is that I think that for the employment world, I don't know when this all dies down, how much would stay, because there is certainly an urge for all of us to go back to the old world. I can tell you that a lot of my colleagues, especially in mainland China, where we're back to, a bit more normal, I think that a lot of these kind of remote working were thrown out because people just can't handle it, right? They feel like the magic of a company is gone. They feel like the culture of a company is, is diminished, right? Because of remote learning. And they feel like it's much harder to keep people, right? The sense of loyalty, the sense that you work for a company is vastly diminished if you work from home and you can zoom from one company to another company. And then you essentially can be moonlighting without people knowing about it. And that is difficult to keep people together in the company, right? So I do think that there are some great things around COVID that will stick, but I think that the old world also has a lot of things that we long for, and we might go right back in there once this all dies down too, right? So I think that there's also some unknowns around how fundamental these shifts will actually be. Thank you.
That's interesting. And it makes a lot of sense as well. I heard from both of you that there are certain things that probably actually started before the pandemic. Some have been accelerated, but then it remains to be seen exactly how much will stick. And I think that's something that I think a lot of us think about in this context, in a lot of contexts, on a daily basis now, in the sort of new normal that at least we have at present. Thank you, Kenichi and Joe. I'd like to turn to Chris and Christina here. After hearing that and knowing what you know, and ask you both, how can the current education system, this is a topic I suppose we could talk about for hours, how can the current education system, or even can the current education system cope with this new normal of the economy and the workplace? Perhaps Chris, if you want to start us out.
My younger daughter was born in the year 2000, and about 5 years ago, she came to me and said, "Dad, I want to be an engineer." And I said, well, let's have a talk about your work life, because even with the pandemic, you're likely to live well into your 90s or perhaps even into the 22nd century. And that means that you're going to have to, from this point onward, for the next 6 decades, you're going to have to think a lot about sustainable and high quality employment so that you don't outlive your money. And those 6 decades are going to be a time of great disruption and uncertainty. The pandemic is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's coming. Climate change, clearly we're going to be facing a lot of that starting even now. It's apparent that the world is not going to make any of the UN sustainability goals. At the same time, there are incredible advances in technology that are expected across the board: biotechnology, materials technology, computation. And in particular in computation, artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to become partners in many kinds of employment, not eliminating the job, but fundamentally changing the role. Some people will be de-skilled because they'll just become eyes and a personality for an AI. Other people will be upskilled because they can use the AI to do the routine things and do much more advanced things that machines are not capable of doing. But unfortunately, education's going in the wrong direction right now because we're emphasizing high stakes tests, which is exactly the AI part of the division of labor, rather than emphasizing the unique human skills. You're going to be facing change at an unparalleled rate because billions of people across the world are going to have powerful mobile devices, digital tools, and social media that connects them. What your employers are going to want more than anything else is they're going to want people who can see opportunity in ambiguity and chaos and disruption, because that's what this whole first part of the 21st century is going to be about. They're going to want students that have dispositions of flexibility and resilience and confidence and initiative. And I said to her, you're really going to have to invent the ways you learn those things inside of our current educational system, because it has no conception at all that that is the future that they're preparing students for.
Thank you. And I'd argue that, you know, we were talking about the future a lot. I like to say, listen, this is reality already, right? And so it's even more of it's even more pressing. I think it's one of the reasons why we're all here today. Thanks, Chris. Christina, curious to hear your thoughts on this question.
Thanks, Ken. So I think COVID-19, like for other businesses, in fact, was a non-negotiable change agent. So, you know, overnight, we pretty much transitioned to online learning. And I actually think that that will continue, but probably in a hybrid mode. I think for us here in Hong Kong and for our students here at THEi, because we are very much an applied learning institution, on one hand, the students really enjoyed the opportunity to review, revise, and kind of you know, enjoy and engage with their lecturers on an online mode. They also missed coming in, obviously, and working in the studios and the labs, etc. So for us here, I mean, we've had online learning and we still are in that mode, but early October, we have said that we will bring students back. So we'll see how that goes. I think in terms of how we are coping, I think it's like, you know, all the other businesses around the world, really. Higher education has had significant supply chain disruption. I think here in Hong Kong, maybe it's less than some of the other countries like the US, Canada, Australia, etc., where, you know, billions have been lost and are invested in that particular sector. I think it provides opportunities, certainly from a business operations point of view. That shift to Zoom Teams has actually highlighted the efficiencies of digital meetings. And although at the moment we may be pretty exhausted from that, I think it will continue to be hybrid. So at times we need to meet together in person, and then there are other efficiencies around the digital. Also, I think because of the travel bans, and the limitations in that currently. I think we will look much more to virtual online exchanges. And as other speakers have already highlighted, that opportunity, I think, to build those bridges is far greater than it has been ever before. I mean, just to highlight this, in May of this year, the Vocational Training Council here had an in-person conference, an international conference that we were going to run. And we had to pivot that very, very quickly. Now, as a result, though, we outreached to some 10,000 viewers in 10 countries with 25 international guest speakers. Now, something of that scale previously we would never ever have imagined. And we continue to do that. I mean, we now host webinars with offshore counterparts more often than ever before. So it's that sense really that, and someone has already said this, that there is this ecosystem of global networks really in the higher education and continuing education system that we now leverage, which I don't think existed to the extent now that it had before. We launched our AET book recently through an online webinar. We're going to hold professional conversations between countries. So I think all of this is, great for the development of a global community of practice in higher education. Just to finish, I think, for leadership in higher education, certainly our recruitment and admissions processes have had to change, and no doubt because of the ways in which we are now engaging virtually, we will continue to do that. Our traditional quality assurance frameworks have had a real nudge because there are things that we've had to do and then we've had to kind of retrofit, but maintain that quality assurance and quality enhancement. Certainly as leaders and executive management teams, we have gone through crisis management and business continuity planning like never before. So I think, as others have said, we have to design now for resilience. We've got to increase our capacity to be agile, to be flexible, and to be responsive, because things are actually still remaining uncertain. So I think there has been crisis, but there's also been great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. That's some interesting points, Christina. I'd like to stick with this sort of general theme for a bit, and actually some of what both you, Chris and Christina, said both preempted something else that I wanted to sort of dig into a little bit more. So maybe stick with you two on this next topic. But talked a little bit already about the role of maybe traditional higher education institutions, right? Many of whom are actually representatives are actually attending this discussion, of course, right? But what should be this role of these institutions, particularly in this reskilling and upskilling? And it's interesting, some of the questions that are coming in on the chat actually do talk to a little bit about this. Reskilling, about upskilling of the workforce, we talk about this. Chris talking about de-skilling is going to be this issue. But how are these people, particularly certain categories of people who are not normally served by universities, right, which is a lot, how should the role of higher education, change in this respect? And again, you've already started to touch on this, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper into this. I know certainly Christina, with you guys doing more vocational education, that's something that maybe is more of your as a traditional, bread and butter. How is that morphing? Certainly, that's Professor Dede, Harvard, which is a traditional, multiversity, we say, it's a research-based university. What should this role be in this reskilling and upskilling, and for a lot of these groups that aren't normally served?
I mean, I think we agree that the future of work has arrived much faster due to COVID. And I think in all workplaces, certainly rapid digitalization, and then particularly in industries, automation has occurred in months and weeks rather than in years. So there is a significant transformation. Now, a key word I think that certainly we talk a lot about here is that of sustainability, and one of our speakers has already talked about that. So we're not only talking about business and operating sustainability in terms of revenue, right? But we're also talking about people and culture. So I won't highlight that because we've already talked a lot about that. But it is about, how do we sustain our people? And I think now employees will look at ways in which the employer or the company has treated its people during this pandemic, because I think that has a significant a realization around the culture and the cultural, the cultural ethics, as others have said. So I was reading just this morning, in fact, a market report on one hand, business process automation, which we are all trying to do, but in terms of manufacturing, on robotic process automation. Now, this market report was saying that the world market size is expected to reach US 25 billion by 2027, and incredible growth at over 40%. Now, what does that mean, though, for those vulnerable workforce workers who normally are doing repetitive work? It means, in fact, they are, and we know already, although, many of them have been at the front of the COVID, the cleanups and sanitisation, etc. We have significant numbers who are out of work. So I think that vocational professional education and training is going to have to play an increasingly significant role in skilling, reskilling, upskilling the workforce, particularly here in Hong Kong anyway, because I can only speak for this context. Now, just for those who are not familiar, and I keep on talking about the VTC, it's the Vocational Training Council. Very quickly, it was established in 1982, so it's been going for a while. And it is responsible for BPET here in Hong Kong. And it operates both from school level right through to degree level, the I being the degree level operator. So there are 13 member institutions, 200,000 learners, of which 50,000 would be full-time. So there's a significant component there, which is about in-service reskilling and upskilling. So in terms of lifelong learning, which Chris has already talked about, the government here in Hong Kong has had quite an agenda since 2002 with the Continuing Education Fund. So that has the opportunity for citizens to access up to $20,000 a year for reskilling. Then recently, there have been schemes such as the V+ Engineering and V+ Creative Industries, which targeted those industries in particular to do with reskilling and upskilling. The VTC across all of its 13 member institutes has a particular focus. And here again, we're talking about multiple levels, multiple industries and professions. For example, the PROACT Training and Development Centres, the Integrated Vocational Development Centre, and our Institute of Professional Education and Knowledge, which is PEAK, plus the other institutes, all provide different opportunities. Now, I think the value add for vocational education, and it's probably true of most of BPET in countries, is it tends to have campuses scattered across that particular country or the region, which I think is a huge benefit both socially and economically, because people can then access their local provider. Oftentimes I think the universities tend to be in major hubs, whereas I think the VPET providers are much more locally located and can be accessed very quickly. Now, you talked about individuals who would not normally access university education. The VTC also has, through its SHINE Skills Centre, the development of employability for people with disabilities. So that includes catering, desktop publishing and retail services. And most recently, it established a social enterprise for SHINE graduates to further their catering skills through the running of cafe. So there are examples here of real, authentic learning in situ. Another example is the Reindustrialization and Technology Training Program here in Hong Kong, which has really got a focus on Industry 4.0. So it's about subsidizing in partnership with the company or the employer the training of, or the retraining, upskilling of individuals, particularly in things like IoT, cloud computing and AI. So that was launched in 2018. So again, that's another funding opportunity. So, I think in terms of the opportunities here, there are quite far-reaching. There's a lot of government support. There is a lot of institutional support. And particularly from a VPET point of view, I think, there are those multiple layers where access can be gained by all citizens, in fact.
Fabulous. No, thank you, Christina. Very fascinating with some of these. Although, good to hear. I won't say not surprising, but it's comforting, to hear that a lot of what is going on, certainly those in vocational space. I'm also curious, you know, for Chris's take on sort of the more traditional institutions, how you believe they can best pivot as necessary in this respect. We know so much of your work has been done on this sort of 60-year, multi-decade sort of learning journey. How should traditional universities be thinking about this, or even should they be at all?
Well, the one thing that every organization should think about often is, what business are we in? 90 miles south of me on the seacoast, there are wonderful historic mansions built with huge amounts of resources from the railroad fortunes a century ago. And those fortunes collapsed within 10 years of the time that the mansions were built, because the people who built them thought they were in the railroad business, but they were in the transportation business. And the automobile and the airplane hammered them. So what business is higher and continuing education in? It is not in the education business anymore. It's not in the degree business. It's not in the course business. It's in the lifelong learning business. And that's a really different answer to that question that changes almost every aspect of both traditional universities and continuing education. I told my daughter that she is facing multiple careers over 6 decades because of the disruption and turbulence in the world, and that many of those careers don't exist yet. So somehow her formal education is going to have to prepare her for that. And what that really means is that instead of thinking about lifelong learning as episodic and intermittent, so somebody comes back to Harvard for a degree or a certificate because they want a new job, or their old job disappeared, or they want a promotion, or some other kind of transition, it's going to have to be continuous upskilling. It's going to have to be job embedded. It's going to have to be life embedded. It's going to have to be every day rather than episodic. And that's a service. Lifelong learning is a service. Courses and education are a product. So that's a huge shift. The other thing that I would say is that what continuing education in particular doesn't pay enough attention to is unlearning. Adults who are transforming what they're doing have a lot to unlearn. If you're coming out of a command and control leadership structure and you're moving into distributed leadership, you have to unlearn a lot of things. If you're a skilled lecturer and you're moving into a kind of workplace embedded coaching and mentoring, you have to unlearn a lot of things. And that's very difficult for people because their identity is caught up in the skills and the knowledge that they have in their career. So unlearning isn't just intellectual, it requires emotional and social support. We see that in people trying to lose weight or trying to stop drinking or trying to do something else that's a kind of a profound change in their identity. We're going to have to provide that. That's also the business that we're in, the unlearning business.
And I wonder the topic, you know, for maybe later in the Q&A, if I would agree, and I would also argue that as many of those railroad barons did not realize the business they were actually in. A lot of higher education appears to me, if you look at what people are doing, they do not realize the business they're in. Some of you may, but some do not, and so there's a definite disconnect. Thank you so much. I'd like to definitely go back to Kenichi and Joe, because I know that they have some things to say here from the business perspective. Because, you know, there is definitely and obviously, and now more and more, a major role that business should have in addressing a lot of these gaps and these challenges. John talked a little bit earlier, give an example about Google's new career certificates. But I'm curious to hear some of the specific perhaps ideas and examples, or just some thoughts, even philosophically, from both Joe and Kenichi about what that role of business should be. We know maybe what traditionally was or what it wasn't, but of course that's changing as well. It might have started probably started even before the pandemic situation. Maybe it's accelerated. So curious to hear both of your takes on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to, at least give some reflections. I think, we are obviously seeing a lot more corporates who feel like they need to be in the front foot of the, upskilling, right, of the workforce, right, and doing all the. And I think technology has a lot to do with this, because I think that before, the difficulty was actually the delivery of the, call it the corporate learning, right? Whereas right now, because of, again, digital means and, really the familiarity of people to be offering these, I think that, before I need, let's say, if I have 10,000, people who need the training, I need to think about like the people delivering, I need to think about the venues, I need to think about all those costs associated with it, right? But now I think that people are trending towards getting actually all that information into a very bite-sized approach. I have companies who are looking at doing 10-minute segments of learning every day before you go to work, right? You got to fulfill a 10-minute segment, answer 3 questions, right? And then you go to work, right? And so I think that as you start thinking around these things, both the delivery and also I would say the way how kind of adults absorb learning, I think that corporates are thinking very much that, this whole digital can actually both accelerate that and dramatically lower the cost of delivery. And that is actually very critical, because your dependence upon a big training department, dependence upon a lot of experts, right, is greatly diminished, because, all you need is one good guy, right? And I do think that this whole transformation, I think, is actually, will increase inequality, because before there were 30 trainers who had jobs. Right now, I need one who is very good, and I need a big IT department, right? And that is very different than 30 people being in classrooms, having jobs, right, and having like face-to-face interaction. Of course, it doesn't replace all of that, but I think that people are giving up a little bit on getting people into a classroom on a Wednesday evening, right, 6 to 8, and hope that that would actually turn into something that's useful. I think as you look into the ROI of those investments, you see that as just being a little bit of a waste of time, right? And so I think that people are, at least corporates are trying to experiment a lot with these different things. And, I don't know how corporates think about the traditional education institution in this whole mix. I think the gap between, a traditional institution, right? And again, I know a lot of you are doing very, innovative things that are going to the forefront of all of this, right? But I think that from the corporate, at least the mindset a little bit is that, look, we cannot rely on them to give us the people that we need. I think the gap between kind of education and workforce has never been greater in my mind, if I look at kind of the graduates that we're trying to produce right now and what actually they're going, right? Whereas the guys who are actually, by the way, very resourceful, have been doing 10 different side jobs already before they graduate, right, are far more equipped, right, to do something than actually they've gone through the 20 lectures at school. I'm offending now most of the participants here, and I apologize for that. But that's really the reality, right? And so therefore we're looking at, as we hire, right, people who have done a lot more experiential things, we look for people who have actually, engaged already, right, in the real life economy for different, ways. And obviously the continuing education is key, but at the same time, I think it needs to be delivered in a way that kind of, can be absorbed in the everyday life of an employee, right? And that is increasingly difficult for that to be both physically and also long durations, right? And so therefore that also can, you can imagine what that may look like. And I would say the last caveat here is, look, some things just take a bit longer. So I think that, if I think about the spread of corporations around this, I think that I have many clients who are at the forefront of thinking about this, right? And they are really thinking around how to empower and, and think about this whole reskilling. I do think that I'm only describing 5%, right? I think that there is a good 70-80% of corporations who are way lagging behind, are not anticipating a lot of these. It will hit them. And I think that reskilling and also retooling the workforce a little bit, I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges for corporates and certainly for education institutions. And that's, I say, a 20-year time frame in terms of how that's going to play out, not the next 3 years, because I do think that will kind of move slowly, and a lot of just corporations will not understand it until it hits them, and that sometimes is it takes a bit of time.
But I think it's good that you're direct. I mean, this is what folks, I'd say, joining this discussion, particularly those in higher, actually need to hear, and that's actually good. So thank you for sharing, Joe. Oftentimes I will quote. I know there was the results from a Gallup poll about 6 or 7 years ago, so certainly well pre-COVID, but in recent years, and where basically they asked two groups of people the same question. They said, do you believe that current higher education institutions are effectively preparing people for the modern workplace? Almost all of the leadership poll, the higher education leadership, presidents, provosts, vice chancellors, something like 96% of that cohort said, yes, we're doing a very good or even a great job, but yet only 10% of employers actually said that. So we talk about the gap. There is this sort of huge gap there. So it's good. So Kenichi, please, very interested in sharing and as direct as you want to be about this, because this is an opportunity to share with folks in the education sector what you're seeing, what you believe is needed.
Yeah, well, I've been working for the corporate company side over 20 years, and in my opinion, corporate is a good field for on-the-job training. So this is very beneficial for the society. In the business scene, there are many trade-off situations. For instance, short-term and long-term revenue, cost profit, team and leadership, and economic value or social value, these things. And people can challenge what they've learned at institutes in this real world. So this is a big opportunity, and I think not only learning, this application is necessary. So learn and apply, learn, apply. This cycle is quite important, especially in the coming VUCA era. So, and also in addition to that, the situation is getting better because I think the many companies become more tolerant of failures, because there is no perfect answer. So they have to try and error, and once out of 10, success. So I think it's becoming more easier to give and take these opportunities to apply what you learned at institutes. So I think this combination between corporate and the higher educational institute is a good combination and necessary for the future. And through online, I think it's also becoming casual to not only for the business person, but for instance, the university student. And in Japan, my company is now trying to give some opportunities even for the high school students to apply what they've learned in their school. So I think this cycle is a good, case and opportunity. So I said it's a good field for the society. So this is my thought.
Thank you. Very important to keep in mind as well, I think. Okay, so because I want to leave some time for to get to some of the theme questions or question themes that some of the audience has had. But final question I have for everybody, and if you could just take a minute or two to sort of consolidate this. So I want to hear your distilled answers to what are some of the actionable steps, next best practices that we can do in addressing these gaps, because we've heard some ideas a bit piecemeal from all of you. Maybe a particular focus on business and education, business and academia collaboration. But what are your specific top 2 or top 3 suggestions, particularly you can share with participants in this call that they can actually do in terms of addressing these gaps. And I'll just go, let's see, on my screen, I see Christina, Kenichi, Chris, and Joe. So maybe we'll go in that order for lack of anything better. So Christina, your takeaway, your best practice takeaways.
Thank you. I mean, actually, I think it's what Kenichi and Joe have just been saying. It is that notion of applied education is going to be, for us certainly, the paramount key to success for workforce success in the future. I mean, you know, applied education has always used an approach where we work with industry, but I think it's got to be more than just a partnership. It's got to be more, and it's got to be more integrated. Here in Hong Kong, the VTC has communication is the key, right? To be able to really engage with the industry and the workforce. So the VTC has 25 training boards, for example, with some 500 members. And together those training boards will actually engage in workforce surveys. So I think it's that real deep commitment and communication between the education provider, applied learning, and the industry or the professions. Now, there are ways that we can do this, and we can do it better. I mean, we all have work integrated learning here in VTC and THEi. Our degrees are up to 480 hours already, but we want to deepen that. We want to look much more at project-based learning. So we're talking about authentic industry or company briefs where the students can work in real terms with real problems. And I know that has some problems in itself because the company oftentimes needs to work fast. But I think we are looking at ways in which we can accommodate that. The other, of course, is the earn and learn. So some of you may know it as apprenticeships. And in many countries now, we are lifting it up to degree level. So again, that means that the student or the learner is actively engaged in the workplace as well as learning on the side. The other is around development of new generation learning environments, where the community, the learner, the industry, the professional associations can come as a hub to learn up, you know, reskill, etc. So here, for example, we've got a cybersecurity centre with virtual projects that's just been developed. We've got a BIM iHub for the construction industry, health tech centre, where you've got that nexus of technology and elderly care in particular. And just to plug, we run here at THEi an Innovate Startup Centre for our young graduates. And tomorrow we are actually running an Entrepreneurial Future Leaders Summit. And that's a webinar. So anyone who's attending now might want to dial into that, because it is about developing the growth mindset, the entrepreneurial mindset for young people. And again, it is about that ecosystem. So it's that nexus, the communication, the ecosystem to support development at all levels of the environment. And my last kind of big message really, if we're talking about applied education as a way in which we can really push workforce futures, reset, recalibrate where we are now to a more productive future, then I think here in Hong Kong at least, the VPET value chain has got to be extended so that we enable THEi, for example, and others that are like-minded to become universities of applied sciences. You know, in Austria, a recent survey said that the public there actually rate a UAS above a traditional university because of its clear strengths and practical relevance and proximity to business and industry and the real world of work. So I think it's something that you talked about who are the players. I think on one hand, it's the government, it's the education institution, it's the community providers, and the industry and the employers, looking at ways in which overall, different countries and different systems can improve that educational value chain so that that parity of esteem for the academically inclined universities and the applied education, and there are crossovers, can continue to really grow from strength to strength. And there is requirement for both. I'm not saying, one over the other, but I think that recognition of parity of esteem is really important going forward. Thank you.
Fabulous. Kenichi, your parting thoughts on this?
Yes, my thought. Yeah. Well, to be honest, I can introduce the collaboration between Minerva and Recruit. Yeah. You know, Minerva has now become also popular in Japan, and they developed a leadership program a few years ago, I think. The name is Management Complexity. It's a leadership program running from system thinking or something, EQ or communication systematically. And last year we made an agreement and we recruit, reskill our employees to learn the leadership again of the job. And on the other hand, this is 3 months course, so they can apply what they've learned every day, every week. So what I said, this is a cycle of learning and application. And this is a good agreement. And we recruit, of course, can give feedback to Minerva to improve their pedagogy. So I think this ecosystem is working well so far. So I think this is a very actual practice what I can share today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's one I should have thought of myself, and that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, and quite actionable and actually intangible. So, thanks, Chris. Your thoughts.
So I think that the partnerships with employers are important, but I also think the partnerships with employees, because people often don't understand what they know and what they can do. I help people teach negotiation using technology. And I was talking to one of the students and he was discouraged because he said, you know, I'm a really good negotiator, but there aren't a lot of negotiation jobs. And I said, well, you understand empathy, you understand collaboration, you understand critical thinking, you understand conflict resolution, you understand rapid decision making. There's a lot of jobs for people with that skill set. Stop thinking about yourself in a role and think about yourself as a suite of skills. I think that's a crucial kind of a partnership that we need to build with employees. I am part of an initiative called the 60-year curriculum. There's no way of really summarizing that in a minute, except to say it attempts to address some of the things that all of us have been talking about. But I am putting into the chat a link to a co-edited book I did that came out a couple months ago. If you don't want to buy the book, you can use some of the search terms there to find our free articles that are written on it. And I hope if you're intrigued by the panel discussion that you'll take a look at that.
That's fabulous. Thank you. That's also very actionable as well. I was just going to say, I was thinking, you know, negotiation class, I mean, this is like good, this is life, you know, basically anything and everything. So, Joe.
Yeah, look, I think that, you know, I agree with a lot of what has just been said, and particularly I think that the 60-year curriculum, that sounds right, I think, and I do believe that the careers of people spending decades and also going through multiple phases as people go through the different eras of their lives, right? You know, even you know, I would say that the third careers, right, is a very interesting topic in general, because you're looking at a lot of people who have a lot more financial flexibility in some ways, but also looking for a lot more, perhaps, you know, ways to apply the skills, right, in a very different context, right, and looking for their own, you know, excitement and all that. And I think that the role of, you know, both education institutions, right, but also, you know, what do we do with these people, right, who are reaching a era, right, of their careers where, you know, they frankly need to think a little bit around what they do for the next 20 years. I think it's a very interesting one. I do want to just, you know, and for the rest of the day, I know you guys talk about this, but one of the biggest barriers, I think, to how a lot of these ideas can work is, I think, a lot of, you know, I call it the the value system of society, right? And as I sit here in Hong Kong, I see the uphill battle where we are going from a society where getting good grades in exams and having one big exam that determines your future, right? Where fairness and and accuracy, right, is the way towards the coveted like professional career that everyone kind of is looking for. I think that's so deep rooted, and I think that goes all the way into employers who basically just kind of look at brand universities, right, as the way to filter excellence, right, to teachers who basically tell kids that this is your only ticket to social mobility, all the way to parents who basically from their own experience feel like that's the only way out, right? And so therefore at least from what I'm seeing here sitting in Hong Kong, is that I see that it's not something where one institution or even one sector can actually change the way how people think about these, right? And I think that value system is so ingrained, especially I'm talking here in like a very Chinese Asian kind of way to do that. And I think that is actually not easy, because we can talk about it all we want, but when it comes down to employers, HR making the decisions on employment, or universities making their decision on admissions, right? And that filters all the way down to kindergarten, right? And so we see this absurd kind of kindergarten admissions process, right? Where people are lining up for those 200 places in this brand kindergarten and primary school, where, the only way that they are teaching is basically to arm you with the skills to pass that test, right? Later on, when you're trying to go to university. So as you think about this whole chain, right? I think that we are talking about the future here, but the future is also very much constrained by, I would say, different segments of stakeholders in society who are holding on to what they know and what they're experiencing, right? And I think that also needs to move a little bit. Otherwise, you are going to have this gap between what the reality is, but what a lot of people in their own judgment, they're all doing the right things, right? From parents to kids to teachers to professors, right? And I think that is where we got to figure a way. And I think, Esperanza and, John and everyone else here, trying to figure out how to, get us to be talking about these and, highlighting, right, that's how things are moving on and will move on, right? And sounding the alarm bell before it's too late, I think is exactly what we should be doing right now. So thank you very much.
Fabulous. We're getting close up to time. I wanted to get some of a few of the questions that participants have asked. Actually, a lot of what our wonderful panelists today have covered, as I've been looking through the questions, get to a lot of the questions that our panelists have asked. Sometimes they're preempting those questions, sometimes they're asking them afterward, which is really great. Let me just throw a little bit of a curved type of question, but I wanted to see if anybody, either of the four of you, had thoughts on this. Role of government in this, anywhere from the stay out of the way spectrum to much more highly regulated. We talked education business today, but oftentimes it is sort of like a three-way sort of pact here. Anybody have any specific ideas, some points about how government can or should be doing better to enable a lot of what we talked about today?
One of the discussions I've been part of is that many societies have unemployment insurance. So you lose your job, you have some money, you look for a similar job. But increasingly, there is no similar job. That job is gone. You're never going to be doing that again. What you need is employability insurance, where it's called different things in different countries, but basically you have a continuous voucher to keep learning in ways that keep you viable economically. And I think that kind of a shift would be an important policy change.
Makes sense. I don't know if either of the rest of you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, I think the company or corporate role is quite big rather than government because to create new jobs instead of the lost jobs, and also the allocation is quite relevant to the business itself. So I think the business sector is crucial in the coming future. It's my opinion.
Another question a few people were asking about is, you know, why don't more corporates start universities? And when I say universities, it could be, obviously, you may guess based on what we just talked about today, it might not be a traditional style of university, but why? And when corporates often play, it's in executive education. There's a lot of this more bite-sized stuff. Why do you think that more corporates are not out there creating much more, I'd say, fuller scope, not full scope, fuller scope institutions? Other than the fact that it's hard, and we know a little bit about that.
I think it's a matter of return, right? So I think that larger organizations, right, corporates tend to put more resources on this because they believe that that actually is important. But one of the biggest reasons why I think the corporates right now are also hesitating on spending more resources on training is because training actually, if you're more short-sighted, right, you know, the value accrues to the individual, right, faster than it accrues to the corporate. So in today's age, right, where the average employment term depends on what industry you're in, right, but certainly for this generation, it's going to be, you know, 18 months, right, where people are thinking around, you know, I would say they're not thinking about careers, they're thinking around, you know, breaking down the careers into different projects, right? So they're much more project oriented than career oriented. I would say that, you know, for the corporate to spend a lot of money to, you know, to train up individuals where they have no, you know, they have no, you know, guarantee or reassurance that that person is going to stay with them for longer than, you know, a period of time where they'll kind of get back the investment. I think that's actually one of the biggest pain points for corporates, right? Both, you know, the short duration of the careers right now, but also a little bit, you know, I just cannot see the return. So you're in a little bit of this trap, right? Where
right.
you feel like you need them, right? And so therefore you don't. And so therefore it's a little bit of a, and that leads to a little bit of, I think that there are some comments here around the inequality, right? I do think that that leads to more inequality because people who are skilled and are more employable, right, they're around. People who are not, but no one actually wants to invest in them, right? So therefore you know, and this whole, you know, I used to think that, you know, a digital world is a big equalizer because you can sit anywhere and, you know, and I think John talked a little bit around, right, the democratization of education, right? I think that it's the big inequality at this stage because I can easily find someone else, right, who is actually better and can do the job. And so therefore the people who are not able to, right, will remain like that unless they figure something out themselves, right? Which is not something where the help is coming very soon. Anyway, so that's just a little bit of a, you know, side point, but I think when corporates don't do it, when the traditional education institutions are not, are doing it in their way, right, but maybe not meeting the needs completely, then you do have a gap there. And I think that there are many institutions who are trying to fill that gap, but that is kind of easier said than done.
Very, very good point there. Listen, well, I want to be respectful of time because we are at maybe even a minute over time. There's a lot I know that can be shared here. There are a lot more questions that people actually have, which means that people are thinking more deeply about this. But listen, we will have another Q&A session a little bit later on where we have a chance to engage with folks. Thank you again so very, very much to Professor Christina, to Kenichi, to Professor Dede, and to Joe. And wonderful to have you sharing. And thanks everyone for participating. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Kenn, Chris, Christina, Kenichi, and Joe. It's a fascinating discussion session. It's kind of like my morning coffee. It really made me think. A lot of food for thought. perhaps it's really time for us to pause and reflect upon the questions and the issues that we've just raised. And as Kenn said, we still have another 15-minute Q&A at the end, and we can still have more discussion.